Welcome to FIAR 432 Video Production Module 3. Camera motions, usually on tripod, objective, subjective format. We're going to be discussing now the kinds of motions that are associated with the camera. And of course, from our previous discussions, this is referring to secondary motion, which is where the camera moves, and in the most basic form, the subject is still, the camera moves. The camera motions are based on the motions associated usually with a tripod, although they can be without the tripod, and often the terms that are used are exactly the same. In our previous modules, we've discussed that there were 6 basic shots, 3 kinds of motion, 3 categories of motion, and that there are certain rules that you want to follow in terms of composition based upon the shape of the camera format. In this situation and in this module, we're going to be discussing the motion associated with the tripod, and there are basically 5 classic motions associated with the tripod. You'll see here, this is part of handout number 2. They are the pan, the tilt, the zoom, the dolly, and the crane. We're going to discuss each of these and discuss their implications in the art of video. The first kind of motion we'll discuss here is called the pan. The word is derived from the longer word panorama and involves the motion of the camera from left to right. The lens literally moves from left to right, like what you see me doing here. The camera is moving from left to right, and this is really probably the most basic kind of motion that you can associate. It's very much associated with the motion of our heads. Our heads pan from left to right very easily, just as this is doing with the camera here. So panning left to right is a common terminology. You'll often hear people saying, if they're referring to somebody watching an event, we need to pan right to see who's doing what, or pan left to see who's doing what. And that refers to the moving of the camera from left to right. Proper panning motion is achieved by using the pan and tilt bar on the tripod. And this panning motion looks like this. This is basically how you pan the camera. Now, planning your panning is part of the more advanced part of using the camera. But basically, this is how the camera works. There is this motion of panning left and right. Now, every motion that you have on the tripod also has a lock. There's actually a pan lock here that allows you to lock the camera into place. You wouldn't normally need this because gravity is going to hold the camera in place for panning. But sometimes if you're out in a heavy wind, the wind might actually blow the camera and cause it to move. And therefore, you would need to use the pan lock. But every motion on a tripod has a lock, a corresponding lock. The next kind of motion is the tilt. This is where the camera moves up and down, and again you use the tilt bar to achieve this. So the tilt is achieved again using that same bar on the tripod, this bar here that my hand is touching here, and you basically lift the camera on an axis. And notice this is the axis here. The camera moves on a tilting axis up and down, and this basically allows you to scan images vertically, and we'll be looking at that some more as we go on. But basically you need to know that aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, as I mentioned, there's always a lock associated with this, and in many of the tripods that you have, the lock is accomplished by a screwdriver kind of motion on the handle. This actually locks the tilt position into place, and you loosen it, and actually there's a certain art to loosening it to a certain level where it's not completely loose, because you don't want the camera to crash down, but you want it to be able to move with a certain amount of smoothness, and a certain amount of friction on there creates what they call a fluid motion. And so the tilting is made more fluid by a certain amount of tightness on this screwdriver kind of effect in the tilt bar of the tripod. And as I say, this is very typical for a lot of tripods. They use this tilt bar screwdriver kind of locking and creating a friction kind of motion setup. The third motion we're going to discuss here is the zoom. Now the zoom is a relatively new kind of motion that was only really introduced in the early 70s. Prior to that, you had separate lenses to achieve telephoto and wide and so forth. And if you ever look at the old cameras, the old TV cameras and things, they would have what they called turrets, where they had multiple lenses on it and they would switch from one to the next. The introduction of the zoom put all those lenses together into one lens, and the motion occurs inside of the lens casing. And the motion of the zoom looks like this. I'm using my remote control here. If you look at me, you can see that what's happening is the lenses are moving inside of the camera and giving you this horrifying close-up of me, extreme close-up. Now it's pulling out wide. I'm now zooming out, and if you look at the drawing that I have shown there, you'll see that when the lenses come together, closer together, you get a wide shot. When they get further apart, you get the long or telephoto shot. And the zoom button is a crucial button to look for on your camera, and I'll show you that. The zoom button can be located in a number of places on a camera. In this camera, it's on the upper part of the camera, and you'll notice that there is a W and a T. The W stands for wide, and the T for telephoto, and it makes a motion like this. Okay, this is how this is accomplished. This is what brings the lenses closer and further apart. And I'm going to try and see if I can provide you with a close-up of that now, so you can see the lenses coming together. What you're looking at now is the lens of the camera in question. And right now it's in the wide position. If I go to telephoto, you're going to see the lens getting further and further away. And in the wide shot, it's closer and closer. So that's basically what's going on inside the camera. You don't see this, but this is what makes the camera create the zoom effect. And this zooming effect made it possible to combine wide-angle, telephoto, and medium lenses all into one. And so this is a kind of motion. It's just a very subtle one that you don't normally see. The next kind of motion we'll discuss here is the dolly. Now, prior to the emergence of the zoom, the only way you would be able to get close-ups and long shots was to dolly the camera. The zoom made it possible to do that with the change of motion inside the lenses of the camera. But prior to that, you physically had to move the camera. And if you look at older television and early television and other earlier films prior to the 70s, as I mentioned, the zoom didn't exist. You literally had to move in, and the dolly motion is literally the camera physically moving in and out, as demonstrated here with this graphic. When the camera moves like this, that's dollying. Now the dolly can be achieved by lots of things. In the most primitive and simple way of doing it, basically the dolly is just literally you physically moving the camera back and forth, lifting it up and moving it in or out. This is done all the time. Again, with the tripod, you'd be lifting the tripod when you move the camera, and this is the most basic form of dollying. But just like the word suggests, oftentimes wheels are associated with this. A tremendous amount of expense has been devoted to dollies in the movies, and I invite you to go online, Google dollies in films. If you happen to have seen the Olympics recently, they actually had dolly tracks set up on alongside, parallel to the runners, and the cameras were automatically and automated. It ran along with the runners. They had similar things for the swimmers. So dollying is really a crucial thing. They spend thousands of dollars putting up these railroad tracks for film cameras. There are people that do nothing but push cameras on these tracks, these dolly tracks, and so dollying is really an exciting part of it. When I was in graduate school, one of the things we did a cheap form of dollying. We got the grocery baskets, and the camera person would sit inside the grocery basket, and someone would push them along, and you could create a dollying effect by pushing the camera person with the camera inside the grocery basket. This is a fairly cheap form of dolly, but dollying with wheels, basically, any kind of a wheeled type of movement is also part of this whole process of the dolly motion of the camera. And you can also see it in cars. Your car can become a very potent dollying things. You'll often see cameras strapped onto the hoods of cars, and then so essentially the car becomes the dolly tripod of the camera and so forth. So I invite you to look into that. As I mentioned to you, that's an exciting part of the process. The final camera motion on the tripod, or associated with tripod, that we're going to discuss is the crane motion. And if you look at my graphic here, I show one form of craning. Basically, the camera is physically lifted up and down. Okay, this is not like the tilt, where you actually tilted the camera up and down on an axis. In this situation, the camera literally is physically lifted up and down. Now you can do that by lifting the whole tripod up and down, or I'm going to show you another aspect of craning, an actual crane motion built into the tripod. Many tripods. Many tripods come with a crank that's built into it, and this is the crank on this tripod, that you can crank up and down, and it will allow you to move the camera up and down with the craning motion being accomplished by a crank. I have a few wires in the way, but basically this is very commonly used, a crank, to achieve this. And as I mentioned to you, they always also have a lock. As I said, along with the crane, or this little cranking device, there is a lock, and this is the lock right here. It looks a little bit like a spigot or a faucet control, but it is the lock. That's important because if you don't lock it, the camera can come crashing down onto the base of the tripod. So the crank and the lock are important for achieving this motion. So anyway, we've talked about the kinds of motions associated with the tripod. These are really the bread and butter of secondary motion in video and film art. They're important tools to get you to where you want to go. We talked about the kinds of shots and the kinds of basic motions associated with it, but for every shot that you do, whether you do a close-up, a medium, a long, or whatever shot you do, there are going to be probably at least 2 or more of these motions you're going to have to do. In order to get a close-up, you're going to either have to dolly or zoom in to the subject. You're going to have to probably tilt up, tilt down. You may have to crane. There are any number of things you may have to do. So the entire process of the art of film and video centers around being able to manipulate these kinds of motions and to understand when to use them. At times, a tilt is more appropriate than a crane. A crane is more appropriate than a tilt. You can accomplish some amazing things by moving the cameras. In some movies there have been effects where somebody looks like they're falling off a building, but instead what they did is they craned the camera up. If any of you saw the Die Hard movie, the bad guy falls off the building. They did that effect in that way. They actually lifted it, they craned the camera up above the person. He stood still with a green screen behind him, and it looked like he was falling, but actually it was the camera that was rising. So again, secondary motion can achieve some wonderful things there. As I say, they spend a tremendous amount of money in films doing these things. I also invite you to look at the possibility of combining some of them. One of the most interesting recent techniques is the dolly zoom, where you combine dollying and zooming. The effect can be very eerie. I invite you to look at Spike Lee's Malcolm X. In that film, right before Malcolm X, Denzel Washington is going to the Ottoman room where he's going to be assassinated. There's a very eerie effect created by a dolly zoom. And so if you get a chance, look for those kinds of things. That's part of the homework you have in this class, is to watch films and videos more intelligently. The last thing we're talking about in this module is associated with another aspect of all of this capturing of motion and of how the camera is used, and that has to do with the objective and subjective format. Basically, if I put myself up on the screen here, you're looking at me with a camera. The camera is acting like a neutral observer. This shot you're seeing of me is basically an objective shot. You are looking through the camera as like a neutral observer, as eyes on a present, or acting as the eyes of a present or a future audience. The reason we say present, it could be a live camera production, in which case people are seeing it live. In the case of this, it's actually been taped, digitized, and streamed, and so this has been prepared for a future audience. So this is, what you're looking at here is basically an objective camera shot. But what gets interesting is when you begin to see the world through the eyes of a character. And this is where we're going to get into the more interesting, I think, of the two formats, and that is the subjective format, where the camera acts like the eyes of a character or the camera person in the situation. In a fairly clever commercial some time back, they demonstrated a person trying to get their keys to drive while under the influence. I have a special effect set up on this camera, but it's basically showing you what they might have been seeing under the influence. Oh yeah, I can drive, the person could drive, and of course the ad basically extolled the audience to not let friends drink and drive. But this is a way of simulating maybe what was going on through the eyes of this person who was under the influence. And so the subjective camera viewpoint allows you to see through the eyes of this intoxicated person. And you can see that obviously they're not in very good shape if they're seeing the world this way. You see me holding the camera here. Basically, what you're seeing now is the objective shot. But if I put my eye up to the camera and then you see through the viewfinder, you're then seeing through my eyes, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, from this standpoint, you're now seeing through my eyes. This would be a subjective camera shot. Basically, anytime somebody puts their eyes up to a binoculars or to a telescope or whatever, and you actually see through that device, that is the subjective camera viewpoint. And I'm not getting as close as I'd like to get, but basically you get the basic idea that when you're looking through the eyes of the character, that's the subjective viewpoint. In this same handout, another term for this camera viewpoint is called point of view or POV. You'll hear that used in the industry sometimes as a POV shot. It's basically the subjective camera viewpoint. I mentioned a popular program, Cops uses it a lot, where you actually literally are running side by side with the police. The camera is like one of the police officers. You're seeing through their eyes as the action's going on. It creates a very exciting effect. There have been movies that were done almost exclusively in the subjective camera viewpoint. The Blair Witch Trial is a good example, where you literally are seeing the horror through the playback of characters looking through the camera and into the camera, showing their horror, but it's predominantly done in the subjective camera viewpoint. So we'll discuss it more. I do think that the emergence of the subjective camera viewpoint has been one of the most important of the kinds of things that have been made possible with film and video, and we'll discuss it more. I might also mention a couple of other good uses of this. If you ever saw the movie Terminator, you actually see through the eyes of the Terminator. That was a subjective camera viewpoint. In the movie, another Schwarzenegger film, the Predator 1 and 2, you actually see through the eyes of the Predator. In the movie Predator, you would see through the eyes of the Predator. He would see an infrared. Well, I don't have infrared to simulate here, but I'm using another special effect, negative, to create the idea of what it might look like to be seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, in this case some alien's eyes that had come. Again, the subjective camera viewpoint allows you to experience this different way of seeing the world. As I've mentioned before, I don't usually give homework, but as an assignment I invite you to look for creative forms of the subjective camera viewpoint, and if you want to share it with us at some point, if you make note of it, we'll compare notes with other classmates further on in the course. But if you see some good examples of the subjective camera viewpoint, then please feel free to share them with us. Thanks a lot.